Ferran is an associate professor from ERAM, Escola Universitària de Les Arts de Salt Catalonia. And I'm not going to speak much about him because I know that he's going to present himself and present his work in his talk. So, well, just wait a little bit and we'll start. So, Ferran, the floor is yours.
Perfect.
You can
Thank you
start.
very much. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Clara and Veronica for inviting me to give a talk today. It's really good to be here. I'm very excited about today. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Ferran Altarriba Bertran. I'm an interaction designer and researcher. I currently work, as Clara said, as an associate professor at Universitat de les Arts ERAM, which is this little design school in Girona in the northeast of Catalonia. And I also have a tight connection with Tampere University in Finland, and in particular with the Gameful Futures Lab, with whom I collaborate in much of the work that I currently do. My position involves both teaching and research. On the one hand, I teach interaction design related courses, as well as courses on design and research methodology. And research-wise, I lead the Playful Living Lab, where my team and I explore how to design things like technologies, objects, spaces, experiences, and similar stuff, with a focus on supporting ways of life that are more joyful, more fun, more socio-emotionally resonant, more experientially rich. And we have the hope that that will also lead to ways of living that are more relational, more caring. And so as part of this broader mission, my work has looked at a range of different application areas, because where in our lives do we not want to experience joy, to relate, to embody care? I've worked with practices, I've worked with interactions in public spaces, both urban and indoors. And lately, I'm quite interested in human-forest interactions, and I suppose that this is why I was invited to talk today. But as I said, my work looks into how can we support joyful ways of engaging within the world, and how making those engagements more joyful might also contribute to making them more caring. Today, I'll discuss some of my work in this area, in particular the work anchored in the design space of human-forest interactions, and I will try to share some thoughts that came up along the way. In particular, I'll talk a little bit about the blurry lines between the human-centric and the more-than-human, about how human-focused projects can still escape the bounds of anthropocentrism, and about how designing things for humans can be synergic with more-than-human concerns. Before I get to all of that, I think it's very important to give you some context so that you know where all of this comes from and are able to decide for yourselves whether it makes any sense at all. So I'll begin with an overview of the research that I've done so far in the space of human-forest interactions, which started somewhere in 2021 and is actually still ongoing. At a higher level, my research in this space has two big components. On the one hand, I look into what kinds of experience can bring us joy in forests, and by extension, which technologies might we design that support those experiences. This is your classic research through design work, which leads to prototypes, of course, but also to design insights, frameworks, and other forms of intermediate level knowledge. On the other hand, I also look at how to approach those kinds of questions methodologically. That is, how do we enact this kind of research? How do we situate it in the forest rather than in the lab? What might be the challenges from doing so? And how do we embrace all that's at stake in forest-related interactions, including the human, but also the non? This second strand of my work is more of a methodological nature. And so how do I do this kind of work? Well, for the most part, I try to spend as much time in forests as I can. Using the appropriate terminology, I would say that I situate my design research work in the very forest, trying to enact as many parts of the process there and to have lived experiences be the main driver. What that means is going out there and co-experiencing forests with different people and in myriad ways. For example, doing casual trips to forests where I do different activities with different stakeholders, holding co-design workshops among lakes and trees, running summer schools in the mountains where we stay for a few days at mountain huts, or going on weeks-long backpacking adventures. Today, I will not cover all that these few years of research have entailed because time is short and there's a lot. But if you're interested to know more about it, about all of those processes and the initiatives that I've been a part of, please don't be shy. And this is work that I'm really passionate about. So believe me, I'll be super, super happy to extend the conversation and talk more about it. But one thing I'll say is that this research has involved and continues to involve so many people, including my collaborators at ERAM and Tampere University, of course, but also students from our school and beyond, and many, many research participants with whom I've shared wonderful experiences in the forest. Over 400 people have been involved in this research so far, in one way or another, from over 40 countries spread across 6 continents, and with all sorts of socioeconomical, cultural, profession, even political backgrounds. So please consider the things that I talk about today as the output of a rich, collective, divergent, and very often very messy meaning-making process, rather than my own thoughts alone. So yeah, to recapitulate, my work explores the design of things, technological and non, that bring joy in human-forest encounters. And it does so by situating the research in the forest itself and letting mine and other people's lived experiences be the main generative material for design. And what's the output of this? What do I contribute to the world of science out of going out in the forest, chilling with people, living the good life, and fantasizing how to support this good life by design? Well, again, today I'll just give you an overview for you to contextualize the thoughts that I'll share in a minute. But the outputs of this research have so far been quite diverse, because on the one hand, I have produced methodological knowledge into how to co-design within the forest. This includes both methodological positionings and provocations, such as the notion of co-designing from the wild, but also more practically grounded contributions, such as the wild probes, a set of interactive tools for enacting and documenting co-design activity within forests. These are contributions that have more of a methodological tone. And at a more design-oriented level, my work has also yielded insights into what can be joyful about engaging forests, and therefore what sorts of experiences might technology designers target if they are to support human forest encounters that are playful, that are fun. These are what I call play potentials of human forest interactions. And quite related to this, I've also looked into what could technology do to support those joyful human-forest interactions. That is, which roles might it take when it comes to making forests more playful and fun? All of that has emerged as I have engaged hundreds of remarkably different forest goers, as I said before, in imagining what kinds of technologies might be resonant for them, which has led to dozens and dozens of design ideas, some more speculative than others, that today I still continue to analyze. At the moment, my team and I are working on prototyping some of those ideas so they can be evaluated in real implementation settings, but this is still work in progress, so you'll have to let me keep it for a future talk. Anyhow, as you can see, my work tries to provide designers with tools, methodological, theoretical, inspirational, that help them create technologies that help humans to access the many joys that can come from interacting within forests. And therefore, one might say that my work is quite focused on serving humans, and they wouldn't be wrong necessarily. This work cares deeply about the flourishing of forests as complex multi-species ecosystems, but its point of departure is finding ways to support human experiences of joy within them. So many of you might be thinking at this point, and why is this guy giving a talk in a webinar called The Posthuman Animal then? I mean, if his work primarily seeks to bring joy to humans, well, life is funny sometimes. But jokes aside, I'm quite confident that my work speaks to more than human concerns in many ways, actually, even if it's anchored in the notion of human joy. In fact, through this work, I've come to wonder a lot about this distinction between human-centeredness and more than human orientations, posthumanism, and such. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but I always get the nagging question, where the heck do we draw the line? But the other thing is, one way or another, my work in this area has always unfolded in tight interaction with more than human ecologies, mainly forests. And that has brought interesting insights that I believe are very pertinent to more than human design and research. So for the rest of the talk, I will try and discuss some of those insights. And to be clear, I will not present any set in stone theory, nor any prescriptive guide. Instead, I'll very humbly share some thoughts that came along the way as I was design researching within forests, and that I would like to see what other people think about. So I apologize in advance if today I bring more open questions than clarifying answers, but I really look forward to the part where I also get to hear from you and where we can discuss. So let's start with the first thing that I wanted to put on the table today, which has to do with how designing things targeting forests can benefit from displacing the design process from the human-made and the human-controlled toward the forest itself. The thing is, we all know how humans can be. very self-centered. I mean, in the context of this webinar, I probably don't even need to talk much about this. It is integral to posthumanist thinking, the idea that we humans have historically been exceptionally good at thinking about ourselves and leaving the others at the expense. And as true as this is, it is particularly obvious when those others are at a distance, when we don't engage them that often or that directly. They are not there, and it's easier to think of them as secondary or even accessories to our agendas. The whole notion of the Anthropocene and the many troubles that come with it builds on that principle. And that raises concerns for human-forest interaction design, mainly because our universities, our labs, our studios are usually physically distant from forests. And one might say that we, contemporary human beings, are also intellectually, emotionally, conceptually distant from forests and from the many more than human entities that conform them. The photos you see on the slide are from the student hall in the school where I'm working and of the forest right behind, a few hundred meters from where I'm currently sitting, yet in appearance, so conceptually apart. So in my work, I've tried to address this challenge, this separation, by turning things around a little bit, thinking of forests not only as the target use scenarios of my design work, but rather as the very sites where the co-design itself unfolds. I've tried to escape the lab, the school, the desk as much as I've been able to, enacting as much of my work as possible out there, between trees and rivers, between dusty paths and windy cliffs. So in different shapes and forms, all of the actions that I've put in motion have always started by creating ample, slow spaces for co-experiencing forests, for surrendering to their rhythms, for letting go, for spending quality time in more than human interaction. In the workshops I've led, I've made space for participants to wander around the forest and for recalling and discussing experiences that they have previously lived there. In the summer schools that I've taught, I've brought the group to spend days in the forest, sleeping in mountain huts, away from the herbs and as close as it gets to forest ecologies. And in my first-person explorations, I've shared countless hours and laughs and sweat and pain, sometimes even tears, with who knows how many other forest goers, which has given us beautiful opportunities to open up, to look both inward and outward, and to reflect on what was meaningful there, both for us, but also for our surroundings. Throughout this situated orientation of deeply living both the positives and the negatives of the forest as an indispensable platform for design has allowed my participants and I to develop a much more nuanced understanding of what would be meaningful to create in those kinds of situations, what would add rather than subtract. And so in turn, it has made space for going past the obvious. And in doing so, for transcending our human impulse to think of forest-related technologies in simplistic, purely utilitarian frames. And an example of that is a situation that occurred during a 1-month backpacking trip that I did a few years ago, where I crossed Spain from east to west over a month and shared countless experiences in the forest with a lot of other backpackers. During the trip, many days we would start hiking very early when it was still pitch dark. And the thing is, the midday was usually so hot, so sunny, that we wanted to get a head start and do much of the daily hike when the weather was still all right. So every day we would start by walking in the darkness for a couple of hours, if not more. And it was a really interesting experience. I mean, we got to witness things that we wouldn't normally. The moon, the stars, that eerie, indistinguishable shape of trees being moved by the wind. It was dark, but our eyes could get used to the darkness. And most of the time it was perfectly okay to just walk with the light from the moon and the stars. But despite that, there was many people who decided to use headlights. They gave them the feeling of safety, of comfort. In a way, they had a point. Headlights made walking easier and definitely less effortful. But at the same time, they reduced our span of vision to that bright little circle delimited by the light. Suddenly, no one around the wearer of the headlight could see anything other than that bright small circle. It was no longer possible to access the rich beauty of the forest in the dark, or the clouds punctuated by the stars. So after all, people's desire for comfort and easiness came at a cost. The joy that we might have otherwise derived from that experience of the darkness was suddenly compromised. Experiencing this situation repeatedly, day after day, led to lots of conversations about the role of technology in human nature interplay. What you see on the slide are some Instagram stories that I made over the days, synthesizing those conversations. But long story short, many of us got the sense that in forests, shooting for ease and comfort all around may actually not be the best way to go, or not at least in many situations. That sometimes to experience the full richness of what forests can afford and to truly connect with them, one might just have to put in some effort, to dare to walk in the darkness for a while, to let the eyes and the body adjust, to get out of the comfort zone, to adapt, to grow. And it might be then, once this process of getting used to has been embraced, that the most intricate yet rewarding forms of joy can begin to be accessed. And that reflection led to a set of provoking questions that I believe are very pertinent for design. Is comfort really necessary in the situations that we're designing for? What may it compromise? What's the right balance between making things easier and not erasing their essence? Using these thoughts as generative material, my conversations with other backpackers led to a pretty interesting design idea, if you ask me, which we called the lazy headlight. Long story short, the lazy headlight is a smart torch that can read whether light is actually needed and serve as an empathic companion for walking in the dark. If the conditions make it truly necessary, for example, if there really is no light at all, or if the path is dangerous, it will obviously get itself to be bright. But if not, it will deem to become impactless, while verbally encouraging the wearer to take the opportunity to delve into the darkness around. I believe that this vignette illustrates very well how displacing the design process toward the forest, of leaving the forest as opposed to just working within it, and wholeheartedly surrendering to the many experiences it can give rise to, can dramatically shift the focus of everyone involved. And in doing so, it can make openings for thoughts and ideas that would otherwise be hard to access. So I guess that this leads me to the first of the questions that I wanted to pose today, which perhaps is a little bit of a leading one. I apologize for that. But can we really research and design for forest-related experiences without living them firsthand and in depth? Can we meaningfully intervene in those spaces while remaining physically, sensorially, emotionally distant? This is a really relevant question, I think, and also a pretty challenging one to work with methodologically, because to truly situate oneself in those environments is not always comfortable. It makes you vulnerable, bodily, emotionally, professionally, sometimes even existentially, right? But perhaps that vulnerability is not a limitation of the approach. Perhaps it's precisely what makes it capable of transforming how we design, how we relate to the worlds we design within. But yeah, that's a story for another day, maybe. So yeah, this is the first insight that I wanted to put on the table. Let's now look at the second thought that I wanted to share today, which also has to do with this idea that engaging forests closely and in depth might be necessary for us to envision meaningful ways to design early take apart. And in particular, this thought relates to how more than human agencies play a role in those situated design processes. Perhaps even more than we tend to think, even if we humans do not deliberately or explicitly create space for them to intervene. The thing is, once you take your design process into the forest, and when you use your and other people's lived experiences as the principal material for design, you're inevitably entangling your process with the forest's more than human activity. Everything you do, everything you feel, everything you think about, discuss, and vision will be impacted by the stimuli you receive. Stimuli that will be in big part come from your interactions with other than humans. Whether directly or indirectly, the activity or even the very presence of the endless web of others in this complex more than human ecology will leave an imprint in the design outcomes of the work. These heavy impacts of more than human activity in the design work were very apparent in my backpacking trip as well, to a point that in certain phases of the adventure, they significantly shaped the conversations that I had and the design ideas that emerged, also in terms of intensity and amount. The thing is, during the trip, I hiked over 800 kilometers. I basically crossed most of the northern part of Spain from east to west, and I got to engage a lot of different landscapes. I started in the Pyrenees, a mountainy region. Then I crossed the deep green forests of Navarra, which was followed by the progressively drier wine region of La Rioja, full of vineyards. I then transitioned to La Meseta, which is this central region of Spain, which mostly consists of a humongous flatland that could reasonably be described as an endless dry desert. And finally, I made it back to wetter, greener, moisty lands of Galicia, which were the final destination of my journey. Having the luxury to enact my process in such different landscapes, to see it evolve alongside them, and to slowly reflect on that interplay allowed me to think a lot about the impact of the ecologies that I kept finding on mine and my fellow backpackers' reflexivity and imagination. And I'm going to use a specific vignette to illustrate how that came to be. As I said a minute ago, the journey started in the mountains, followed by deep green forests. There, the ecologies were blossoming, diverse, abundant, one could even say wholesome. I enjoyed that a lot. We were constantly in explicit interaction with more than human others, stimulated by them, and the flow of ideas benefited from that. On a daily basis, we documented anecdotes that led to reflexive thoughts, that led to design ideas, not always necessarily in this order. The more than humanly abundant setting where we were, hiking, discussing, reflecting, ideating, was really conducive of nurturing the design work. But then again, as we progressed through the journey, we started crossing toward landscapes that were progressively drier, progressively flatter, to a point that they became almost inert. And most importantly, they got more and more repetitive. Approximately halfway through the journey, there were about 3 days where the landscape was completely flat. The ground was almost completely dry. There was almost no visible wildlife or much vegetation, actually, other than an occasional tree every kilometer or two. And damn it, even the path was utterly unstimulating, to a point that one of those days we walked for about 20 kilometers in a perfect red line without seeing anything other than endless flatlands around. There wasn't much around, and for sure nothing we hadn't seen a million times in the previous few days. Nothing we had not experienced until that point, discussed about, imaginatively worked with. And as you may imagine, the flow of conversations, of reflections, and ultimately of design ideas that came from them were brought to a halt. It got to a point that it simply didn't work anymore. Not because we didn't want it to, but because there was not much experiential material that we could work with. We had lost the more than human factor, the source of lived experiences that helped so much to feed our thoughts and imaginations. And it became really hard to work around that. It wasn't until we delved back into the richer, more than human ecologies that our conversations became richer again. And that made it very clear to me that more than humanness had a central role in this kind of work. Whether I wanted it or not, whether I had planned for it or not, if my approach was to situate my work in the actual forest, the presence and activity of more than human others around me was immediately necessary and consequential. Using plain words, the way in which this realization was discussed with my non-designer or theorist backpacking fellows was that if the forest didn't do its thing, if it didn't throw things at us that we could experience, there was no reflection or imagination going on. And that resonated a lot with me. And it made me wonder whether these kinds of design processes situated in forests are actually and inevitably more than human at their core. Even if the primary participants of the design process are humans, even if they're primary designing things targeting humans. What I realize is that once design is displaced towards the forest, more than human agencies do not simply surround the design process. They actively shape what becomes imaginable, whether we intend it or not. So this leads to the second question I wanted to pose today. Could it be that any research situated in the forest is inevitably more than humanly shaped one way or another? Which leads to the subsequent question of, are the boundaries of what counts as human or more than human-centered design practices that clear after all? And so this was the second thought that I wanted to bring up today, and I think it makes a really nice segue into the final one, the third. Because in many ways, what the vignettes discussed so far illustrate quite well is how displacing the design process into the forest and allowing it to chime in, how truly leaving the forest rather than just working about or toward it can dramatically shift what becomes imaginable to design. It allows the emergence of ideas that are not only grounded in richer experiential materials, but that are also more mindful of the qualities that make forests what they are. And as discussed so far, this is very relevant for design. But I believe something else happens too. These kinds of engagements do not only broaden our capacity as designers, they also affect us as people. When we spend time in attentive, embodied co-presence with forests, we begin to develop a deeper appreciation of them, not as abstract entities or backdrops to human activity, but as complex living ecosystems of which we are a part ourselves. Earlier, I said that we humans can be very self-centered, and that is probably true, but we're also deeply empathic creatures. through direct skin-by-skin contact with others, humans and non-human alike, we develop attachments, we develop sensitivities. And with those sensitivities often comes a sense of accountability, a sense that care is not an obligation necessarily imposed from the outside, but something that emerges from connection itself. Literature on care supports this, right? Framing it as a relational phenomenon that emerges also in effective interactions. In the previous insights, especially the second, I talked about how this relationship between slow experiencing and empathy is relevant for design research methodology. But now I want to turn to the design things themselves, to the experiences that the technologies we create try to engender. Because the thing is, as I already said before, during those few years of researching human-forest interactions and involving a lot of different humans in thinking about how technology could enhance them, we have produced dozens and dozens of design ideas. What you see on the slide are little drawings that either myself or my fellow backpackers did, as little syntheses of the many design ideas that came up as we hiked through the Spanish wilderness. Because of the orientation of my research, the primary cornerstone of those ideas has always been joy. In one way or another, all the ideas seek to engender human-forest interactions that are experienced as joyful and mainly by humans, right? But the interesting thing is that in examining those ideas retrospectively, we have come to realize that in most cases, in those ideas, human joy comes as a result of a strengthened, deepened, more than human connections. They kind of approach joy as something that results from engaging forests more closely, more empathically, more deeply. An example is the memory t-shirt, which is a garment that gradually changes its appearance based on the forests where it has been worn, incorporating colors, patterns, or traces derived from those ecosystems. Over time, it becomes a living archive of those embodied relationships with different forest ecologies. And in this case, joy doesn't come from technological novelty, but actually from a strengthened emotional connection between the wearer and the places they have inhabited, remembered, and carried with them. Another example are the cut-through-time glasses, which are a speculative device that allows the wearer to scroll back and forth through time and perceive how a same forest changes across seasons, how it looks in winter, in spring, in drought, in full bloom. And so by allowing people to experience forests through temporalities that escape the narrow frame of the present moment, or even the narrow frame of human ways of dealing with time, the glasses support richer, more nuanced ways of relating to forests as living systems in constant transformation. And here the joy emerges not from controlling or optimizing the forest, but rather from developing a deeper appreciation of its rhythms, its cycles, and its autonomy as a more than human ecology. These ideas show how technology might support humans to experience joy in interaction within forests in ways that do not frame those forests as a product for easy fix entertainment, but rather as complex ecologies within which one may joyfully relate. So seeing how doing precisely that, connecting with forests deeply and joyfully, helped build a sense of care and accountability in my own and my participants' engagements during the backpacking trip, it's brought me to wonder a lot about the potential connections between care and joy in these kinds of design spaces, about the promise that relational joy might actually be a socio-emotionally resonant path for cultivating care. This is something that I'm currently looking into, and I'm far from having worked it all out. But I think that there's a lot to explore in this intersection between human joy and more than human care. And today we'll not dive more into this. But again, if anyone's interested in this topic, let's talk, because I would really like to collaborate on exploring this topic more and deeper. But going back to my train of thought, this kind of thinking has raised some questions. Could we support more caring ways of relating to the more than human by helping humans find joy in interacting within it? And more broadly, if we extrapolate this question beyond the specific frame of joy and care, and also beyond the specific setting of forests and towards broader conversations in more than human design, could the design of things targeting humans still lead to byproducts that are more than humanly beneficial? And therefore, could the design of things for humans, which would in principle be seen as human-centric, still be more than that, as something that leans towards, if it's not fully embedded in more than human frames? And with this, I've covered the three thoughts that I wanted to put on the table. And I think I'll leave it here for now and start to conclude my presentation, because I've probably talked too much already. But if I try to condense what I've been circling around today, it may look like something like this. First, I've talked about how situated design transforms imagination when we displace design from controlled human-made environments into the ecologies we're designing within. What becomes imaginable shifts, different values surface, different questions arise, different kinds of ideas become possible. And this is particularly relevant when designing things related to forests, because they are environments we've unfortunately grown a little bit distant from. Second, I've explored the idea that design situated in forests inevitably involves more than human participation, sometimes actually in very explicit ways. Once design unfolds within forest ecosystems, more than human agencies do not simply surround the process, they shape it. They influence what is experienced, what is discussed, what is imagined, and ultimately what is designed, or even if anything is designed at all, as we saw in the vignette of the flatlands. And importantly, this is true whether we plan for an explicitly more than human encompassing process or not, whether we deliberately invite those other than humans into the brief or not. And finally, I've fabulated a bit with the idea that by producing artifacts that cultivate relational joy, we might also be making openings to more than human care. When joy emerges not from control, from optimization, but from deepened connection, attunement, it may foster a sense of accountability and responsibility toward the more than human worlds we are part of. And what that makes me think is that there might be ways in which designing for humans is inherently more than humanly productive too. What all of this in combination suggests to me is that designing for humans does not necessarily need to mean designing against or in neglect of more than humans. When grounded in situated relational engagement, designing for relational human experiences, such as joy, for example, may instead become a pathway through which more than human livelihoods can also be embraced and cared for. And this is important because I'm not simply saying that we should ethically consider more than humans in our work. We definitely should, but what I'm suggesting is something slightly different. That situated design processes are materially shaped by more than human agencies, whether designers intend for it or not. And that anthropocentrism, therefore, is not only an ethical problem, it's also methodological and epistemic condition that is shaped by distance, by abstraction, by disembodiment. And that by designing from within ecosystems rather than for or about them, we transform imagination, we transform values, and also the outcomes in ways that destabilize the very boundaries of human-centered and more than human-oriented design. And I think that this last point is very important because it gives us a very tangible, very accessible, and I would say quite actionable starting point for designers to open up their practice more and better to those more than human concerns. Starting by going out there, engaging the more than human world, surrendering to its experiences, building connections with it. These are all things that we can do with no need to be experts on posthumanism or theorists in more than human design research. And I believe that such level of actionability is very important if we are to expect the designers out there in the industry, in the real world, to live and work by this premise. And I'm super aware that none of those thoughts are necessarily groundbreaking. I mean, across disciplines and contexts, there are many people exploring related ideas in design, anthropology, STS, multi-species studies, environmental humanities. I'm pretty sure that many of you in this room are working on those kinds of things. And many of the thoughts that I shared today might already be very familiar to you one way or another. There's a rich, growing body of work engaging precisely with those questions. But what I hope that my own work adds to this conversation is something perhaps a bit more modest, but hopefully useful. I shared some examples that are rooted in hands-on practice, hands-on design practice, examples that show how those shifts can unfold, not only at the level of theory, but also and especially at the level of practice, of how to more than humanly engage with workshops, with backpacks, with conversations, prototypes, speculative artifacts. If anything, I hope that my work and the thoughts that came from it help demystify more than human orientations in design a little bit. I hope that they show that this way of working is not necessarily too abstract, too unreachable, or exclusively reserved for explicitly post-human projects. Sometimes those more than human shifts may simply emerge when we humbly take time to situate ourselves differently, when we slow down, when we attune, when we let the forest do its thing. So to conclude, I guess I'll circle back to the beginning and speculate that perhaps more than human design doesn't always necessarily need to be about radically rewriting the brief, so it's explicitly focused on more than human concerns. Sometimes it may just begin by modestly relocating where and how the brief is enacted, even if at its core, it's primarily centered in responding to human needs. Today, I think I raised some questions that can be pertinent to this idea. And I'm far from having definitive answers to them, but I believe they are worth sitting with, and I hope that they resonate. And with that, I think it's time to open space for discussion. I'm very happy to answer your questions if you have them, of course, but more importantly, I really look forward to hearing your own stories and the thoughts that come with them. So please feel free to share your own thoughts in relation to the questions that I brought up today, because I'm very interested in hearing what you think. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ferran, for such an inspiring talk. And I'm sure all of us felt the same. I was really feeling not only inspired, but really as almost as I was in the forest with you, trying to put myself in your in your feet and walking through the forest. Very inspiring. And I had immediately a few questions, but I will reserve them to the end to open the floor to, because I do know that in our audience we have people interested in designing and co-designing with the more than human as well as co-designing participatory methods with the more than human, which I think really speaks to your talk as well. I can see colleagues in the audience that are doing this, working in this line of research. So any questions to begin with? Yes, 2 questions. Antje, the floor is yours. Yes. Maybe a few words to present yourselves and say where you're coming from, and thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, Ferran. My name is Antje. I am a researcher also at the Institute of Social Sciences of University of Lisbon, where Veronica is also working. We are colleagues, and I also work with Clara. So it's a pleasure for me being here, and I followed actually Clara's invitation. I'm not coming from design, but I'm interested in the more than human, and my background is more also in education. And it was super inspiring to listen to you. And I'm trying to be brief in my questions. What came to my mind was how do you, for example, relate to what Aldo Leopold, I don't know if you're familiar with his thought of so he's one of an important environmental philosopher. He wrote that book, Stanley Alchemac, and that famous phrase of sentence of thinking like a mountain. And he was watching a wolf dying, and that all that changed his way how he's relating to the non-human. So I was wondering how that just being in the forest, or even maybe also where no trees are in that landscape of La Rioja that you described, or I think it's more Burgos where it was just straight.
Exactly.
You can also have maybe deep experience also in the desert. So my question there would be, what is that more than human? What type of quality are you looking for in the more than human? Can it not also be the desert, or can it be some other encounter like Leopold was describing? So yeah, maybe that is my question because my doubt, for example, came also from there that here in Lisbon, we had recently a very inspiring exhibition about our relationship with Brazil, and they had several artifacts about the Amazon, and people came to the Amazon, so they spent but it was in the 70s when they started actually looking at the Amazon just as a source of resources that we can just exploit. There was no attitude at all at looking at the forest with a concern for the forest, but that it's there for our use. So they spent months, years there, but the attitude was just, okay, this is something we simply can grab and use. So that was my question, how just when you say designing being in the forest and with the forest, what else might be needed than just simply being there, and what has it to do with our own values, our perspective, how we look at it? Yeah, I think that's more or less what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess that there were a number of things popping up in this little remark, and I'll try to pull as many of them as I can. If I miss anything, just feel free to put it back on the table. But thanks for this question, because it's a really pertinent one. To me, the core part here, or at least my own mechanism for staying connected to more than human concerns and trying to find a way to, I would say, smoothly bring those into the design project, is this lived experience, is this skin to skin contact with those, and trying to push myself to find the joy in that contact, in that relationship. So me being there, obviously you can be in the forest through a range of different attitudes and for a range of different purposes. You can go there to just extract stuff, whether that's materially, intellectually, or otherwise. What I try to do is start by experiencing things there. And when I say experiencing things there, I mean experiencing things with myself, with the people that surround me, if there's people at all, and with the other beings that are around, either directly or indirectly interacting with me. And it is through that positioning of living experiences in the forest, rather than just going to the forest to work, and positioning that at the center of my process, that the conversation revolves around the things that feel valuable there, that feel resonant, that feel meaningful. And obviously there, my values as a human being become a part of the process. Probably if I would think differently, societally, politically, then the outcomes of the work that I do would shift. But at the same time, when I do this kind of work, as I said, I involve a lot of other people who have different values, who have different perspectives on society, on the world, on the relationship between humans and non-humans. And to me, it's very hard to delineate where the ideas come from at the end. What was the main influence of an idea? And that's perhaps one of the magics of it all. I create those boiler pots where we, and when I say we, I mean myself, other people, and other beings, do things in the context of forests, cherish those things, celebrate those things, and then reflections come up, anecdotes are documented, and hopefully design ideas come at the intersection of all of that. Some of those ideas, in retrospective, feel super interesting and super, I feel they have potential. And some others, I look at them later, I'm like, I personally do not find resonance in this idea, but someone else might actually. So in a way, to go back to the origin of the question, my approach to staying true to more than human concerns is living with those more than humans as much as I can, and through the lens of my values, which are values of respect toward them and cohabitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferran. Thank you, Antje. And Sebwan? Seb?
Yes. Hello, Ferran. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really fascinating, and yeah, it gave me lots of food for thought. I'm coming to you from, maybe you can see?
Yeah, I can.
Quinta
Thanks for that.
Quinta in Alentejo, where I'm currently volunteering, and I did my PhD in the Netherlands on essentially animal ethics in wildlife conservation. And now I'm really working about trying to move theory into practice, and we can talk more about that maybe offline. But I was wondering, so the forest, you're using it as a sort of a backdrop, a setting, and you have a deep relationship with the forest. Do you ever ask direct questions? Are you ever in conversation with the forest and other earth beings in the forest? And if so, how does that go about? And a sort of second question is the methodologies you use, how would you imagine they might be different if you were going more into a multi-species approach, so not just forests, but other animals? And I was just wondering what kind of journals you're publishing in, and what the feedback is on these kind of methods, and if they're very open to it, or if you've had any pushback from journals about these kind of methods.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. So I'm going to go one by one. If I miss anything again, just let me know. It's reaching towards the end of the day, and my sort of brain capacity starts to thin. But starting with do I inquire directly into the more than human? Actually, my point from today's talk was the point I was trying to convey is the work that I do is kind of focused on designing for humans. And usually at least at a direct level, I involve humans. And obviously, we engage other than humans by being there, by interacting with them, by living with them. I want to highlight again the word living with them, but I don't go and ask them directly. And actually, that's an area of design research methodology that I'm starting to learn about, but that I'm still quite unfamiliar with. I would say I'm way more versed in participatory methodologies involving humans than involving other species or other beings. So I haven't deliberately asked the forest as such, or non-human entities in the forest. This is something that I'm really interested in, but I guess from a methodological perspective, what I try to bring at the moment with the work that I've done is this notion that even if you at the direct level engage humans, focusing on designing primarily for humans, non-humans still play a part. They still heavily or lightly impact the design process. And if you start by living as a way of thinking, as a way of researching, as a way of designing, then I think you're closer to perhaps not inquiring directly into what those other entities might need or want, but at least getting a sense of that and incorporating that more in the work that you do. And so in a way, what I think is interesting about this is that as I said later towards the end of my talk, is that I think it demystifies design a little bit, or more than human design a little bit. Aside from being a researcher of those kinds of things, I'm an educator and I teach undergraduate design classes. And when I teach, user-centered design, some design students already frown an eye. And when I say participatory design, they're like, "Oh, involving others that are not experts in the design process." When I mention more than human design, I see their eyes like popping, like their fuses break. And so it becomes quite difficult for them to even dare to try, and let alone processing the theory. So I'm very interested as an educator, as the trainer of the future generation of designers, to find ways for designers to start playing a part in this world, to start doing things a little bit more than humanly, without having to very explicitly, very focusedly do clearly post-human work, if that makes any sense. And then regarding the last question of where do I publish this kind of work, well, I'm mostly anchored in interaction design, human-computer interaction, as the kinds of artifacts that I build. So conferences and journals in that domain. The Designing Interactive Systems conference, it's a really good home for more than human-oriented design at the moment. Like it's a really big thing happening, and definitely it's super welcome. The Kai conference as well, Tokai, like essentially HCI-related journals and conferences that have a strong design tradition will be a good home for this. And then more design-oriented journals and conferences like DRS, designing, co-design, these sorts of venues. The Participatory Design Conference are also, I think, good homes at the moment for more than human-oriented methodologies and design projects.
Yeah, thanks. So more creative. I think I've been looking at the wrong journals recently.
It could be. I mean, from what I'm standing, at least in the communities that I engage, the whole notion of more than human design, more than human theory, and such is really blossoming, and people are getting really excited. And you see an increased presence of those in the publications, but also in the conferences. So look into it. And I'm happy to give you some pointers if you reach out at some point. I'm happy to guide you around.
Yeah, I'm excited to follow your work.
All righty.
Right. I think I'm going to give now the floor to Daria. Do you want to make a question?
Yes. Hi. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Ferran. So I'm a PhD student that came from anthropology, passed through conservation biology, is back to anthropology with a permaculture design certificate. So I was thinking about this kind of work. Well, a part of it you answered, because I was looking at your presentation and thinking, why is the focus only on like very complex technologies? Because what I was expecting was a more, more traditional kind of design, just like the way many indigenous communities have done so for, centuries and things like that. Like we seem to have lost a bit of that. And when it seems like when we even think and consider designing with the more than humans, we always think of it as a place to extract knowledge from, not to co-create specifically, and more also in the context of an anthropocentric world still, because it seems that we're always thinking of what we can get for us, not for the other beings with whom we share the world with, So I wanted to know your thoughts about that, and also would like to understand if so, considering that the forests and the more than human beings that have either direct or indirect effect in designs, so these may be like medicines, these may be like helicopter wings, these kinds of like very technological things. Shouldn't we have laws to actually legally include these modern humans within the patents of these designs, or the products that eventually result from these designs? Because it seems like, again, we're always looking at nature as a place where we can extract something from, but then we don't seem to give back either protection or even, literal money and effort to basically heal our relationship with it.
Yeah, thanks. Again, lots of things popping up. I'm going to try to address all of them. If I don't, please call me out on that, and I'll reroute. Okay, I'm going to start with the last one, and I mean I totally agree with what you said. My perspective on design, and that involves designing for humans and designing in relation to more than human worlds, is that of respect, and is that of accountability, is that of relationality. When I conduct such design process, I always try to put that as a forefronting value in the conversations that I have, in the kinds of experiences that I try to stimulate, in the reflections that I try to poke, and in the ideations that I try to facilitate. Is there a possibility that things we design cause harm? Obviously, yes. Even if it's unintended, we need to keep a close eye on it. And I think the whole question of whether we need to legislate and things like that, I'm going to be very modest here and say that I don't have the right expertise to attest on that, and B, that I think it escapes the kind of contributions that I, as a design researcher, usually make. Intuitively, as a human being, if you ask Ferran, I would say yes. If you ask me as a researcher, I will say my intuition says yes, but this is not my area of expertise. But I would hope that people in this room who are working on fields and from perspectives that are probably more akin to this kind of intellectual space, I would hope that they're working on this kind of thing, because yes, we do need that. And I think underlying it all, there's this notion that, again, we don't want to be extractivist about things. So that connects with where you started, and to me, one thing that I wanted to bring up through my talk, and I hope that in a way I did that, is that I don't think that there's such stark such thing as a super stark binary difference between human-centric and more-than-human approaches. Obviously, you know, there are extremes, and you can be extremely anthropocentric and like neglectful of the more-than-human world, and you could go absolutely towards the other opposite and design just for non-humans, just engaging only non-humans and such. But there's a huge spectrum in the middle. And what I wanted to try to talk about is how in my work, which mostly, at least at the direct level, involves human participants, which involves those human participants to create technologies that mainly seek to cater to human joy. Still, in those kinds of works, depending on how you do them, depending on where you situate them, you can actually bring that closer to the side of more than human concerns. And in a way, you're not going to be designing a technology for a non-human, but you will still design it in a way and end at a place where more than human concerns are encompassed, where non-humans might, at the very minimum, not be negatively affected. And if at all possible, there might be byproducts that also benefit them. That's the kind of approach that I take. And that is not to say that I think that we don't need to design things for non-humans. I think we do. But in the case of my work, at least over the last few years, I've mainly focused on designing things that help humans experience joy alongside other than humans. And again, circling back to, I think it was thought number 3, one of the interesting things that I've begun to munch over, or an idea that has begun to sort of boil, is that in many of those experiences in the forest where we sort of have a sense of joy, of fulfillment, of like this, you know, little fire that makes us feel really grounded and really connected, joy usually comes with some degree of connection with care. We're there, we build a relationship, we cherish, we celebrate. And when we celebrate something, when we cherish it, aren't we closer to caring for it? And so maybe through my work, which primarily in the first level tries to cater to human experiences of joy, I think that through this kind of work, we may also be able to give back to other than humans, perhaps in a less direct way, perhaps in a more modest way. But this is an idea that I'm starting to entertain, and this is something that I'm trying to delve into as I look deeper into this kind of work. So that was the second. The final one was about advanced technology versus sort of more traditional technologies, or even non-digital technologies, maybe the word here. Honestly, in my own work, I don't mind. I never start with the technology. I don't care which technologies I use, and I deliberately adopt a very open-ended notion of what technology may or may not be. The main interest I have, or my main way of doing research, is starting by surfacing joyful forms of experience that take place in specific situations, in this case, forest. Once you understand things that can bring us joy in forests in ways that also keep us connected to the many things we encounter there, then with that information in mind, which is what I call play potentials, by the way, I made mention of that in the talk. Once you're aware of those things that bring us joy, then you can design something highly technological or non-technological at all. And I think it's just a case of designers building on their expertise in terms of the resources they have at their disposal to shape experiences with the right tools. Probably some of the examples, many of the examples that I gave today were somehow technological from a digital perspective. I think that some of them were super advanced, like those cut through time glasses that allowed you to see the forest in different moments of the year. But at the end of the day, the lazy headlight, it just needs a light sensor and probably a speaker and a little bit of computational power. So, I mean, it's still digital, but is it that advanced anyway? So hopefully that gives some answers. But thanks for the question. Those were very good ones.
I don't know if there is anyone else who wants to say. Oh, Bia, please.
Okay, I managed to unmute myself. Hi, Ferran. My name is Bea. I am a PhD student between Carnegie Mellon University and the university here in Lisbon. And yeah, I absolutely loved your talk. It's it's kind of similar to a lot of the stuff I do, but instead of forests, is oceans. So
I'm aware of the
I
work.
was, yeah, I really enjoyed. So thank you. There were lots of thought that that made me reflect on also my work. So thank you for that. But yeah, no, my question is, you know, I feel sometimes with this kind of work and embedded in an HCI context, that I mean, as you say, there's a lot of more than human and post-human HCI bubbling now and happening now, but I still find that often the question is, so what? And like you always have to connect it to a technology. And sometimes I find it a little bit frustrating as a designer because I find that sometimes I want to detechnologize. I want to just say, let's go to the ocean, let's go to the forest, and let's, you know, take a step back and then think about our practice in that way. And does it really need to do we really need more technology to connect deeper with the more than human, or do we actually sometimes need to take a step back? And I was wondering what your thought process is in that sense, and whenever you design something that is related and you do this kind of work, what are the reflections that come to mind?
Thanks for the question. This is a really good point. And in a way, I mean, I'm not going to be the first nor the last to say that sometimes the best decision is not to design anything at all. And that has been said, you know, in HCI and interaction design, it's been said a lot. And there's even like a paper that I usually cite that says that a good outcome of a research through design process might be that we don't need to design anything at all, and that's it, and that's perfectly fine. That being said, again, like I'm not a big fan of binaries, you know, technology versus non-technology. This is such an oversimplification, even for a designer like me, let alone for someone who does theory, right, who likes to problematize. To me, technology is just a way of supporting experiences, and technology used as a broad term, it can have a lot of different affordances. There are so very many things that technology can do and so very many things that technology cannot do. And so it depends on the situation. The way I approach this is I surrender myself to experiences, and I deeply engage in those experiences. As much as I can, I do that with others somehow, and then with those others that are humans, and therefore I can have, you know, an oral conversation with them. I try to reflect on the experiences we're living, to try to make sense of what is meaningful in those experiences, what's at the core, to just have a conversation about this beautiful thing we're living, and then try to put that essence, that droplet of what makes that experience resonant, to put it on the facade, on the forefront of the conversation. And then once you're there and you're like, you know, experiencing something really deeply and talking about that thing, and there's a consensus among the crowd that that thing is really valuable, then if you drop the question, could technology do something here? You quickly realize whether the answer is yes or no. And if the answer is yes, automatically, even the most technoscepticists will actually start to brainstorm. I have this example from the backpacking trip. I met a lot of people there. And as you can imagine, the first reaction of 98% of them, I'm just saying a stupid number, right? I don't have the statistics, but the primary reaction of most of them when I disclosed myself as someone who's doing this kind of work, they were like, technology in forests, no, because that's the easy, like, binary ideological position, also from an identity projection perspective. Well, there's this this girl that I hiked with for, I don't know, 6 or 7 days, and you know, we started talking, blah 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 blah. Ideas never bounced, but progressively she got more and more interested in the work, to a point she ended up producing design ideas herself, like taking the time to document them herself. And I was like, whoa, it's really cool that you're putting so much, you know, thought and love and time and energy into this. And she was like, yeah, you know, Ferran, the first day when you explained to me what you do, I thought this is bullshit. But as we've been hiking, as we've been experiencing things, as we've been imagining things together, now it makes a whole lot of sense, because really those conversations haven't been about like, let's force feed technology into any situation, but rather, you know, slowly surrendering to living things, trying to understand what about those things really makes sense, is resonant, and is also ideologically sound for us, also at a more than human level. And then thinking, well, could technology do something here? And if anything, what would it do? And so I do think that there are many things that technology can add, whether we strictly need it or not. Again, binaries, need it or not, like adds or subtracts. Like I think that there's such an interesting world of grace in between. And in fact, I have to say, one of the papers that I mentioned in the beginning, where we explore roles technology can take in delivering or supporting joy in human forest encounters, one of the taxonomy items, one of the types of technology or roles of technology that we suggest is just taking a step aside. I think the headlight, the lazy headlight idea is an example of that. It's situations where you're like, actually technology shouldn't do anything here. So even if it started doing something earlier, it should actually deliberately stop doing anything so that joy can be accessed. That's the way in which I approach it. Running away from binaries and then trying to understand very well in each experience what might actually add. Does this make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a very thoughtful answer. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Well, I don't know if there is any other question. If there isn't, oh, maybe there is. Okay, so I think we have a question in the chat. So I'm going to read. Sorry for type the question, but I'm on the train. I was wondering what you as a designer have learned from the more than human designers. So this is the question.
Talking, just to be like, for me to understand the question well, are we talking about non-humans who may be seen as designers, or are we talking about humans who do more than human design?
Well, I'm not sure, because this was written in the chat, but I think it's human designers, non-humans.
Yeah, okay, that clarifies. Thanks. Because, you know, it was kind of two separate questions. Okay, well, the first thing I'll say here is, again, like in my work, I haven't deliberately treated non-humans as designers, yet I have stumbled upon the reality that they play a role anyway. So I'm only able to touch on the surface of this, but this is not something that I've experienced in depth or in you know, in a comprehensive way, and even less so something I have researched or thought as much as someone else maybe has. The first thing I've learned is that they will inevitably play a role, and that has been a very humbling realization. Also, a very empowering one, because in a way, it's made it also for me less intimidating to do things that I feel can belong to this space of more than human design. The second thing that I guess I've learned, and it hasn't been something that comes from me interacting directly with them or even seeing them as designers, but I guess it's a reflection that has come to mind, which is, who am I to design for them? Because, you know, like when it comes to designing for humans, I am a human, so at the very least I can design for me and for the things that I think I would value as a human. I can also talk to other humans and see things that they would cherish. I feel that I'm in a good place to define starting points for my design project. Do I, and it may be a limitation of my own expertise and my own knowledge, but do I have the means to understand what the bird would want? Probably not. And for me, this question of, am I one to actually do something deliberately for them, targeting them as my primary output in the first place? And it's a question that I don't have answers for, but it's been nagging me quite a bit. And the same goes with involving them in the design process actively. It's something that I haven't done a lot, but I've seen a lot of work doing that. And I think it's really exciting, but it always comes to this question of, well, did this mushroom ask to become a designer with you? What do we mean by design? Is design something that's a primarily human activity? Is it something that also philosophically can involve others? Who asked those others if they wanted to be a part of the design process? And those are questions that I absolutely have no answers for. I'm sure that people who are more actively doing deliberate, explicit, more than human design would have interesting thoughts on those, but those are questions that I haven't necessarily addressed too much, insofar as, again, my work has usually explicitly involved humans and then implicitly, I would say, involved non-humans, but in more lateral ways. So it's probably only a partial answer. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay, Veronica, you want to say something?
Yes, if I may. I found it really interesting and inspiring the way you found as an entrance point this joy. I really like joy as your entrance point in all your approach to co-designing with the more than human. And I was wondering, and it really speaks also to the work we do in animal studies with the effect studies and how we affect each other in these multi-species messy entanglements, which are never and sometimes because they're messy, they don't bring only joy, they bring other things, other kinds of effects. So I was wondering if you'd come across in your exploratory research and your research with other effects that cut across joy and that kind of make it more messy, more complex. And I'm thinking of fear, for instance, when we cross and we walk long distance in forests. Fear can be a very strong effect and mutual, reciprocal. If we find an animal, they will probably be fearful of humans. So there will be and these encounters can be very impactful for both parts. And I was wondering if you've thought about this, if it intersects with joy and our capacity to foster joy or not, or if it makes joy more brightful. And also with the fact that, and in this project that we are now working on about wildfires and how big wildfires impact the landscape and forests in particular, there are also this topic of the damaged landscape. And when we walk across a landscape that has been burnt, there's no joy, at least in the first moments after the fires, right? There's grief. So there's also this contrast. And then the landscape begins to recover and begins to sprout again in the next seasons. And then joy slowly builds up again. And so I was wondering if you've thought about this, if you've come across any of this, and how would you co-design with all this? Thank you.
Those are very, very good questions, and some of them will probably require me to twist a little bit the neurons, but let me try to address them. Well, the first question was about how experiences that are not necessarily positive also play a role when we talk about joy and more broadly forest experiences. I mean, here I have to say, like, when I use the word joy, I use it more from the lay-term perspective rather than trying to adhere to a very precise definition of what I mean by joy. And in that way, to me, when I say joy, and maybe that's something that I should have clarified, I mean things that make us feel alive, connected, vibrant, that make us thrive. So long as that is a part of the experience that I'm exploring, playing with, designing for, I'm fine. Whether, a theorist on joy, again, would count that as joy or not, then that's a different story. I'm a designer. I'm much more grounded in actual design work and tangible experiences. And so in the work that I've done, many, if not all, experience had an element of discomfort, of pain, sometimes of tears, but that was kind of implicit in the joy that was derived from them. And I think that the example of the darkness sort of spoke to that. You cannot experience the immense beauty of the darkness, of a forest in the darkness, if you don't go past this first layer of I'm feeling uncomfortable. I have a little bit of fear because I'm gonna trip. What if a snake comes at me and I don't see it? So there's this heavy sensation of discomfort that you really need to get used to before you are able to begin to actually attend to the beauties around. And again, this is very much thoughts, information, and I'm still munching on many of those ideas. But I think that there's something about forest experiences, for sure, and possibly experiences with the more than human world that require some of those edges. That for us to actually access the joy, to establish meaningful connections, we need to also embrace some of those discomforts. Another example that I didn't mention today, but I'm also a trail runner. I love going to the mountains and running and such, and climbing a steep hill and getting to the top of the mountain is awesome. And if you get there super exhausted, like breathing labored and with your legs burning, it amplifies the joy you receive at the top of that mountain. So there's pain. In that case, there's physical pain even that's involved, but it makes reaching the top and enjoying the marvelous landscape much more of a deep and, I would say, also connected experience. Like you find a much more direct connection between the geography of the place and your own body sensations. So I do think that joy in those instances involves not only positive experiences, or at least it doesn't involve a purely positive experience at its whole. It has layers that make it challenging. And I'm starting to think that might be needed in many relations we have with the forest. And I'm, maybe we can extrapolate that to the more than human world as well, and to other more than human ecologies. Then at some point, I think I caught something that made me think of the idea in your question, that made me think of the idea of people experiencing joy potentially being a source of us damaging ecologies. And then again, this is something that again, it can happen. Like you can design something with some effects or intended effects, and then you put it into the world and it backfires, and then all of a sudden people use it in a way that actually it breaks things and it damages and it harms. And obviously that's not what I want. The way I try to mitigate this or to prevent this from happening is, first, again, I start with living things. As I live things with others, we talk about things. And it is in this conversational part of the work, in this relational, dialogical part of the work, that ideology comes into play, values come into play, both mine and other people's. And usually when it may be the case, there are many instances when people drop ideas that actually have elements that are quite edgy, that could be damaging, but someone else will say something about that. And I found it to be quite rare that in the concluding parts of conversations, ideas clearly seem extremely anthropocentric, extremely neglectful of the more than human ecologies around. So the very fact that we're there celebrating that moment, celebrating the things that compose that moment, make it more likely, I think, at least in my own experience, make it more conducive to us not immediately coming up with ideas or consolidating ideas, pushing for directions where the ideas can bring harm. Then again, unintended things can happen. That's why in research to design, you prototype things, you do small tests, you try to see what happens, and then you reroute. And I have to say, many of the ideas that I discussed today and that we've produced began at a speculative level. And now we're in the process of developing some of the prototypes that we're more excited about, or that we see, or we have intuition might have more potential. I can get back to you once we've deployed some of those prototypes and when we've collected some data on what actually happens in the real world.
Just to clarify, my question was not so much about people misusing your products, but actually it's very useful to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that's a big concern of all of us. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I think it's useful for everyone who's doing research, and also to acknowledge that it's out of our hands. Once we put things in our world, there's a part we can't control anymore.
And then, like, going back, that's a very good point, but going back to the last part where you talked about situations where joy shines by absence. You talked about grief. I think those situations also bring opportunities for us to feel alive and to feel connected and to feel socio-emotionally reassured and supported. And so my question is, like, in such stark, dire, challenging situations, what could we design that bring people this warmth, this sense of connection, this sense of remembrance, maybe, that help them feel alive, that help them to, even in the direst of conditions, to somehow thrive and to be hopeful. To me, this would be under the umbrella of what I think of as joyful, and the kinds of design work that I'm interested in. I haven't specifically worked with such kinds of conditions, but I'd be very interested in exploring how that might be, or hearing from your guys' work, which I guess delves into those areas, about the kinds of experiences that people seem to crave and want to engage with. Very interesting area, I think. Very underexplored also.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the answers. Very good.
Well, I think I will just also speak a little bit and also make a question. Not so much a question, actually. I would prefer to debate, or to pick on some things and see what you think and what your thoughts. One of the things that I just come to my mind when you were speaking about also the joy and care and the experiencing of the forest, and it was about empathy, that it's an important process in design to well, even if when it's human-centered, we have this the empathy for other humans, or that are in a particular situation, or it's important for us to put ourselves in that place, and also to design, and this idea of empathy is also important in the more than human context, and to have empathy for the and I was remembering that which in your work it's more than human, but it's focused on humans. But I remember to see a work of Daniel Metcalf. I don't know if you. He does multi-species design, and he did this. He has this article, which I don't remember the name, but it's about in a master class. It's in education, and he basically did this experience with the students to create empathy for them to put themselves in the places of different species of animals, and this empathy was like a method before then designing or addressing the to understand more about the animal species, not just for what you can research, but also putting yourself, and so in this way you spoke about the indirect impact. And I was thinking about this, the indirect impact of bringing people to a different place, and kind of led them to experience what they might not experience otherwise. So this was just something that came to my mind, because I think it's important, even for a practice. It could be something that can be used as a practice before as a method. What I'm saying as a method, not just this is for humans, but the experience of humans of more than humans can be also a method to then apply to more than human to non-humans projects that are related to non-humans. And the other thing that I wanted to that I wanted to discuss with you, because you spoke about this, and it's this distinction, or this between human-centered and more than human or post-humanist design. And I think it was interesting because in a way, when we think about and this is just like my way of seeing it, so I'm just going to share with you, and then, well, in the way I see this, like you said, in human-centered, we have a lot of more than humans, because more than human, like materials are more than humans. The thing is, we don't think as them as subjects. We think as objects, as something to use. So I think they are not the priority in a way. So I would see this as a way of thinking. They are not the priority, and how they are affected, it's not considered. But I don't really think that we need to have a project, or our design process don't need to be actually intended for a particular more than human, or a particular species, or to actually be more than human. Because in a way I see it, it's like you also said it, if we consider the relations that we have and in this situated in this particular spaces that we have, so it's not so much about who is the individual that is intended to, but it's more about consider that they are there, that they exist, and how they are affected, and just that is a big thing.
I agree with you.
Yeah, so
I very much agree with you on that. I'm not sure that this is at least I've seen a lot of different takes on the matter. And I myself, it may sound like a stupid thing, but I think it explains a lot of things. When I write a paper, I refrain very much from framing it too much around more than human concerns, including the word more than human in the title, having it appear too many times in the introduction, having it be one of my core keywords, or even framing the methodology explicitly as more than human design. Is that because I think that my work is not more than humanly oriented? Probably no. I don't know. Like, to me, it begs the question. I don't see human-centered or more than human as, separate categories, distant binary categories, but rather as a spectrum. You can be doing things, and it operates probably at different layers. Because I've seen works where a designer co-designs with a mushroom to create a chair or some sculptural object, and they are framed as more than human design, but at the end of the day they're designing something that's purely for the human. So then I ask myself the question, is that more than human than a work that is meant that targets the creation of something for a human while encompassing the participation and livelihood of other beings in ways that are perhaps more respectful than just exploiting the mushroom to create a chair. So to me, it's less of a clear-cut discussion, and definitely not one that I believe lends itself well to binary distinctions. And the more I think about this, I come to the conclusion, and perhaps it's a bit of a bold one, but if the difference between more than human design and human-centered design is that in more than human design, we do account for the livelihoods of non-humans, and I would very much agree with you on that. I think that that's where you are getting, and I think I'm on the same boat. Then more than human design is just good design because it accounts for those who are actually involved in the bigger picture of that design project. And so, to me, that the notion of accounting for the livelihoods and the flourishing of those involved is at the core. It's the core premise of human-centered design. It's the core premise of more than human design, with the very asterisk that more than human design explicitly acknowledges the fact that not only humans are involved. And at the end of the day, this is at the core of good design. And so this is like, experiencing this firsthand as a designer, also as an author who tries to get his work published in a liminal space between, participatory design, interaction design, more than human design, and who sometimes struggles with being a part of that overlap. It's made me think a lot about how the separations between those different spaces may be less stable than some communities like to think. And in a way, I find this like interesting tension between how, when we're theorizing, and people who theorize about the nature-culture divide and sort of criticize that divide, stating very rightfully that there's no such thing as a stark difference between nature and culture, and that we are also nature, and that that this is a sort of a binary that we should debunk. At the same time, think sometimes of more than human design as this very sort of narrow category that's heavily distinct from other practices in design. And I think that this is a friction. Once we assume that there's no such thing as the nature-culture divide, at least not in binary terms, then all of a sudden the difference between human-centered and more than human is far from being a binary one. And to me, it's more of a gradient in a way. But that's my take. I think we agree a lot on what constitutes more than human design from what I've heard from your intervention. I'm just not sure that this is what I always see when I see people presenting work in this space or discuss work in this space, let alone review work in this space, I can say from first-person experience.
Well, yeah, I think well, this is also more than human design is also something that is it's beginning, so there is much work to do and to go for. But in the way I see it, what you describe, for example, as a mushroom share, it's much more human-centered in that context. That's something that is intended for humans. Like, for example, I don't know, imagine that there is this building that is being done, but we consider that there are some certain species, certain beings that are in that place, and that the building is developed, consider that they are there and to accommodate them. So I would think that this, even if it would be a more than human design, that it can start with a briefing that it's for humans, but it can include the non-humans in a more acknowledging them, that they are there and that they matter and that they would be affected and how to affect them. And one of the thing that you said, and this is also my way of seeing, that you were speaking, which is design is not perfect, because we can think in paper and things seem to work well, but everything that is in the real world would never be perfect. And even the building process of some product, it would have impacts. Even the materials we choose and all that would, you can be develop something and then it would be, the materials would impact some animals or some other species because you need to cut some trees to have the wood, for example. This is just, so, well, all that is, it needs to be considered when in this area of more than human, I think. And so it's complex, but it's also important. And like I said, I think it's the way of doing good design. It's considering the more than human, what's there, and who else is there, and who else is going to be affected. So yeah, and I think I'm speaking too much, and there are people wanted to.
Yes, I was going to. Yeah, thank you. Great discussion, because this is also it's about discussing these ideas. Great discussion. I would suggest, because we are 9 minutes past, which is great, like a sign of success, Ferran, but not to take too long. If it's still okay with you, if you still find to answer another couple of questions, there are another
Absolutely.
2 questions in the audience. So I would invite Agatha first, and then Ana Luisa. But first, Agatha, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, yes, hello everybody, and hello Ferran. Nice to see
Hey,
and hear you
Agatha.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for context, I was lucky to participate in one of the summer workshops, summer camps that Ferran and the other professors at ERAM are organizing while I was a student at Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania. My background is maybe a bit more different because I studied film directing and then for my master's digital interactive arts, but still while I was there, it really was very accessible. So like the practice that Ferran is really teaching and proposing to the students, it was really accessible for me and for my colleagues, if I may speak for them. But at the end of the camp, I was feeling like a designer, let's say. But yeah, my question, I will keep it brief because I know we're past the time. But my question and my curiosity for you, Ferran, was how do you direct your thoughts or like your curiosity, your practice when you can not be in the forest? Because most of us have to live in the city, let's say, unfortunately. And for me also, because that the experience that we had that summer, in the Pyrenees, in the mountains, and at the hut, it really kind of educated my mind to think in this like research way, like in this methodological way. Let's say when I'm in the forest. So whenever I am in the forest or like in nature, I really try to take time and to think and to feel, and as you said, like, and even after the experience, but most of the time I cannot be in there. So I was curious, what do you do when you are mostly in the urban forest, in the urban jungle? Or yeah, like, is it mostly comparing, or is it you try to find things that are new to the city? Or like, how do you direct your thoughts? That was my question.
This is a very good question, by the way. Very nice seeing you here, Agatha. And it's great to also, hear the thoughts of someone who was able to be a part of some of those processes. It's also nice to discuss with you at this level, having been involved. To me, I mean, there's different layers to it. I'll start by saying that I personally, as a human being, made the deliberate choice of living in a small village rather than in a city. And obviously, there are a lot of variables, economical, personal, political, involved in that. So I'm not going to say, hey, everyone, go live in a small village, because I know that it's much more complex than that. But I did make that choice because forests are very important to me at a personal level. And, being in close contact with forest ecologies is very important to me, but at the same time, it's important to my work. And so in that sense, I do spend a lot of time in forests, in the moments that I can consider work, in the moments I cannot consider work, and anything in between, because as we know, with situated practices, work and life sometimes blend in inexplicable ways. So that's something that to some extent we can do. We can get closer to the places we research and design for. And I think with forests, it's something we need to try to do. When that's not possible, I think it's important to create windows for intense relation with those ecologies. And so I think the backpacking trip that I did a few years ago, I think it's an example of that. I institutionally made space for those really deep and slow dives. And so I think that that's something that those of us who have the privilege perhaps of working as researchers, we can accommodate that. It may challenge things for us a little bit logistically, temporally, politically within our institutions or such, but those are things we hopefully can do. But then, as you said, and that's a very nice, very pragmatic thought, Agatha, as you said, sometimes we just cannot go to those environments, or we have access to environments that are where perhaps our capacity to engage other than humans is less immediately accessible. And that is true for perhaps cities and urban spaces, but also I think the example where I talked about La Meseta, that's those flatlands where all of a sudden it felt like there were no experiences coming at us. What to do there? What to do when it's a little bit harder? Well, I think a lot of people in More Than Human Design are actually working on, methodology for accessing, for interacting, for, drawing insights from those relations with other than humans, not necessarily only in context where there's opulence, and but rather in situation where it's a little bit harder, a little bit more hidden, a little bit less accessible. Personally, I have not developed methodology in this space, but I think that there's, as many have said today, there's a lot of blossoming work in this space of design research methodology. So definitely something to continue working on, because it's true, right? I mean, we're designing for more than human worlds, and obviously that's very evident when you situate yourself in a deep forest. But when you're walking around the street in the city, there are more than humans or other than humans everywhere, and their livelihoods are equally important, and the potential of finding joy in our relationships with them is equally promising. And so how to deal with those perhaps less clearly forestry scenarios, something I haven't necessarily explicitly worked with, but I'm keeping a close eye on folks who may be working on that.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Ferran, we still have a hands up from Ana Luisa, and then we have questions in the chat, but from what I can see, there are many questions, which is great. Like Diogo is really enthusiastic about your work. My suggestion would be, if you're still okay with answering another question, that we would take Ana Luisa, and because Diogos are written, you can always take note of them, and Diogo could reach out to you and you could continue the conversation elsewhere. Would this be okay?
Yeah, that sounds excellent. Yeah, let's hear Ana Luisa, and I'm going to respond to that. And then anyone who wants to reach out, I'm happy to answer in text or have a follow-up chat or stuff like that. Just feel free to reach out to me and we'll talk.
Great, thank you. Ana Luisa.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question before the real question. I really like that you referred the possible result of a design process that can be a non-intervention. And I've been entertaining that idea and would really like if you could share the author's name of the paper you mentioned so I can look more into it.
Yeah, so please reach out to me afterward and I'll provide that information.
And I'm still very new to More Than Human Design. And since you're situating your research in such an immense ecosystem with subjectivities in each place, so I understood that it can be a specific forest, but it can also be a backpack trip that goes through various ecosystems. So how do you define or frame the place where your practice happens? Where are you going next?
Yeah, this is something that I've honestly struggled with, especially when writing the papers and getting them published, because I say, I started by framing this work around the concept of nature, because, I mean, we who are in academia and who read those papers, and especially those who write those sort of post-humanist thinking papers, we're well aware that the concept of nature brings so many travels and is so edged and so, but when I go talk to people and I'm backpacking, they actually use the word nature, right? And so because that was the word that was articulate to my conversations with people, that was the word that I started using in my own writing. That became that created big conflicts in passing along the message. So I started derailing from that concept and started using the word forest, which carries less weight on that front. The issue I found there is that indeed forests can be so very many things. It's such a fluid concept. It's such a fuzzy concept. And so that didn't pass the bar either necessarily. And so honestly, I don't necessarily care which kind of forest I include in my processes. So long as the people who engage that forest think of it as a forest. And so what I try to do is reflect in the papers I write and in the design work that I do, the qualities of the forests that I engage. And most of the times, again, that has to do with documenting the lived experiences that serve as the starting point for anything that happens later, documenting those lived experiences in vivid ways, in ways that do not privilege the rational, but rather privilege the experiential, the embodied, the sensorial, and hopefully through those vivid accounts of those experiences and the conversations that happen and where they happen, and taking a lot of photos and so on and so forth, I'm able to capture some of the essences of those environments where things take place and then convey them in the work that I present. But it's not easy, because at the end of the day, if in any of the vignettes that I discussed today, I had to account for each embodied sensorial quality of the forests where things took place, we would still be in the first thought, and I wouldn't have been able to do so. So it's usually the situation of trying to balance or trying to think carefully about how much information do I give about those forests, how much is needed, and usually the way I'm working with this. Maybe it's not the best way, but that's the way that works for me, is bouncing with the audience, whether that audience is people like you in a talk, whether the audience is reviewers of a paper, whether the audience is my, colleagues at work with whom I debate ideas, whether the audience is my partner with whom at home I'm talking about the exciting new idea that I got from a forest-related trip. So I try to work with it in this way.
Perfect. Shall we wrap it up here, Ferran?
Sounds good to me.
Yes, it's perfect. It's been a success because, time says by itself, such a success it was. I would apologize to Diogo. Diogo, apologies, but I would invite you to reach out to Ferran. Ferran, I'm not sure you shared already your email in your presentation. Maybe you did, and I
it was
notice.
Somewhere on a slide, but let me just
maybe you
post
can
it on
post
the
it as well. So anyone that wants to reach out, because Diogo's questions are also very interesting and big lines of exploration. And as for my part, and I'll pass it on to Clara, we will probably pass it on to you. I just want to thank Ferran very much. Thank you so much. It was so inspiring. I'm sure there will be many lines for further discussion with us. We hope we can do that in the future. But for now, thank you so much for generally sharing your work with us. And we look forward to hearing more about it, because it is really inspiring, as everyone has said. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to do the same. Thank you for coming and for your presentation. And it was really good to see your work and to hear from you, and these discussions are very important. Well,
wonderful.
I don't know if you want
to. Maybe we should pass it on to Ferran, and Ferran closes the session. But before that, I would just add that we usually, for those that are still in the room, we had many people in the room in the beginning, but as usual, it's normal, people need to leave. We usually have 2 sessions of the posthuman animal per year. So this would be the first, and more to the end of the year we would have another one. And so keep an eye on our social media and our websites to see who's going to present next and the dates which are still not fixed. And also we expect, as accord with Ferran, to make this talk public on our YouTube channel, so you can always check it later for questions and so on. Over to you, Ferran.
Wonderful. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening to my thoughts, B, for engaging so deeply with them and bringing me things on the table, asking things. I was really stimulated by several of the questions, so I thank you guys very much for that. And I already said it a million times, but I'm going to say it again because I'm really interested in that. If people are interested in the things I talked about in the conversations that emerged, please do reach out. I really like to do collaborative work. I think if you have a look at my list of publications, you'll probably realize that the usual is that there's more than 5 or 6 people in every paper. I really want to continue exploring those things. And I think that bringing in different perspectives is the right way of doing that. This room clearly had a lot of those different perspectives. So please do reach out if you're interested in those things as well, because I really want to talk to you and further those thoughts. With that, thank you very much, and I hope I'll see you around somewhere, somehow, sometime.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.